Hi, my name is Joe Cernik. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University in St. Charles, Missouri, and this is a show called Insight. Now, we discuss books on politics on the show, both domestically and internationally. Sometimes historical books that provide some insight into the present, and sometimes broader atmospheric or trend analysis books that address issues involving politics. Today's book is international. It's about the building of railway lines by China, from China through Southeast Asia. It's written by Will Doig, and the title of the book is called High-Speed Empire, Chinese Expansion and the Future of Southeast Asia. Now, joining me on the show today are three Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is James Hechler. To James's right is Eric Bideri. And to Eric's right is Priscilla Adesheyoju. And so I wanted to read an opening quote from the book, and then we can jump into a discussion. The author writes, "To keep growing, China must keep building, if not at home, then in other countries. Domestically, it struggled with a glut of development. But beyond its borders, it's just getting started. Only about 3% of overseas lending from the country's two largest policy banks is currently going to One Belt, One Road investments, this being the building of railway lines from China through Southeast Asia. There's still plenty of room to grow."
I would definitely agree with that opening statement. China is definitely back on the world stage as far as being an economic powerhouse, but unfortunately, due to their geography, especially in the western part of China where it's very mountainous and it's a desert, they really can't develop a whole lot through western China and Tibet. So what they have to do is they have to go outside of their sovereign borders and expand and develop infrastructure both in their neighboring countries as well as other countries overseas.
Yes, China is definitely trying to become a superpower, or the largest superpower that there is right now. And they're trying to put their hands in every single place that they can reach to, so that they can keep bringing in wealth and economic growth to the country themselves. But at the same time, they want to expand and help other countries develop as well while they're doing this.
Yes, I agree with the both of you. Technology in China is really going to new heights. Literally, modern infrastructures in China are like the best right now, so they're trying to like explore and expand into other countries as well. Like the author mentioned that a real estate developer built a 57-story skyscraper in just 19 days. It shows that China is really doing one of the best things technology-wise, and they are trying to also expand to other countries so that they can be up to par in the technology world.
Yeah, when I read that, 19 days to build a skyscraper, I was thinking, wow, one, I'm wondering how safe it is. And two, it's like I need to look it up and see whether somebody was taking sort of slow motion, fast motion, that still frame cameras, because 19 days. He was starting off the book trying to show you that the ambitions that China has and what they can achieve, because he talks about Shanghai, that people didn't think they'd build a subway system. And they did, and it is now the longest in the world, over 400 miles, carrying somewhere around 3 billion passengers a year. And so as a result, the author was trying to point to that as an example of involvement in railway systems, and that they have this ability, so they've already shown it within China, to be able to achieve railway development. So the idea of then taking it outside and being involved in it, in this case in Southeast Asia, is something that you're going to now see a very great deal of.
Absolutely. kind of understand where China is coming from and why they are so ambitious anymore these days is you kind of have to look back through their history, particularly the last 100 years. They have coined it as their century of humiliation, where starting around the 1800s, you still had Imperial China at the time.
Yes.
Now, once Europe started infiltrating and trying to overtrade in China, you started to have an issue where China just simply could not keep up with Europe at that time, especially after a series of wars, such as you had the two Opium Wars, you had the Sino-Japanese War of 1895, and it really just brought China to its knees, and it would just keep it that way right up until the late 40s and early 50s, when we see China slowly but surely starting to get back on its feet infrastructure-wise. And ever since the 90s, especially with the construction of that subway in Shanghai, we really just see China just going all out and just no sign of stopping.
Yes, you're very correct, because I also read in the book that even though the whole infrastructure and modern technology is everywhere in China and widespread, it's not in every part of China, because some rural communities still have like the old ways of transportation. So they are still trying to be up to par with the actual technology. It's not like it's every part of China that actually has this new modern technologies, like you said. So seems very interesting.
What I found interesting was how China did not expect themselves to do more than what they have right now, how they'd given themselves till 2045 to expand by 200 miles, and then in a few years they just completely went double that, you know. So I like how they were very humble with their period, just so that they could crash it very quickly.
Quote from the book, "One Belt, One Road is a plan to reclaim the country's global centrality with the hardware of its worldwide trade stretching across Asia, Africa, Europe, and all of its ultimately flowing back to the People's Republic of China." And so that the railroad system there, he's trying to make sure that we understand that it's placed into this broader setting. It's not just something advantageous for Southeast Asia, but there's real reasons for it for the Chinese.
The One Belt, One Road system also has a little bit of symbolism involved with it. It's a reference to the ancient Silk Road that was constructed by the Han Dynasty way back, let's say the first couple centuries AD, and it was able to link trade between China and Greece and Rome way back in the day. And for hundreds of years, they just had that trade supremacy with the rest of the world before China decided to just isolate itself a little bit more. And of course, the Mongols invaded during the Middle Ages. So what we see now in the modern world, and this is especially true with ideas of the Pan-Asian Railway, to develop a railroad that stretches all the way from Pakistan to Iran, which is thousands and thousands of miles, you're really seeing China really wanting to bring back that old glory that they had.
China is definitely trying to bring back the new Silk Road. That's exactly what they're doing. They want to make sure that there's free flow of trade going between the three continents at good prices, instead of how prices are right now with shipping goods among the three continents. It's quite expensive, so now they want to make sure they have a cheaper system that will be able to be fast and efficient for people to trade among the three continents.
A quote from the book, he writes, "China envisions the tracks diving southward, crossing into Laos at the abandoned city of Bataan, and working its way down the peninsula through Laos, Thailand, and Malaysia before terminating on the island of Singapore." And so obviously you're going to have to build this over a great deal of waterway to then get to Singapore. So this is a massive undertaking. It didn't give a sense of how long it would take, but you don't get the feeling that it's going to be for decades to get it off the ground.
I would definitely like to talk about Laos a little bit, and especially that city of Bataan that you had mentioned. It started out as basically just a small village in Laos, really unassuming, not very impressive at all. But once the 1990s and early 2000s started to roll around, China was able to stake a deal with Laos where they would be given somewhat of autonomy in Laos to go to China. And in return, China would decide to build up the infrastructure and basically make it into a metropolitan area. Well, things unfortunately would get out of hand since, as the author points out, he liked to call it Las Vegas, where it just turned into basically casino resorts everywhere, prostitutes running amok. It basically just turned into absolute chaos and nothing less than an eyesore for Laos. So it was shut down and subsequently shut down in 2010. And there, other than building that railroad through Baton, there really isn't any other plan to redevelop Baton.
Yeah, it's sort of like you built a city out of nothing, and then suddenly it was all Chinese money, and then suddenly it was there, and then it was gone, and then the Chinese seemed like they got annoyed because there were a lot of killings of people who were Chinese that owed money to Laotian gamblers, and suddenly Baton was gone, and so now it seems like, I guess it's coming back if the railway system is going to go through it again.
Yeah, I'll give it to China for building the railways in just less than a decade, when they actually projected about 50 years for it to get built. So it seems very ambitious of the Chinese government to do these things really fast. And also, if you read some part of the book where it said that China is about to build 40 airports in 5 years, they are actually right on par, because I did my research and they do 8 airports every year. And so next year we're projecting another 8 to make it 40 airports. And that's really good.
The building rate of that, I had heard that before from somebody that does investing in China, and thinking, wow, it's a lot of airports to be building.
Yes.
He talks about Laos in the book as being important to China because of its natural resources, which he says are timber and minerals. He went on about that they have, and his quote is, an abundance of water, more water resources per capita than any other country in Asia. I was trying to figure out why he brought that up, because it doesn't tie in. I'm trying to figure out they then need to send water back to China. So I was under the impression there was some reason for bringing all that water up, but I couldn't sort of see it from the book.
Yeah, you definitely see with Laos, and especially the rest of the countries that are down in that area, they have really always been subject to exploitation by other countries, be it countries in Europe or China in this case. Laos originally started out, along with Vietnam and a couple of other countries, as part of the territory of French Indochina, which was France's territory in the Far East, basically from the late 19th century on up till about the 1950s, when they just decided to just pack up everything and leave from there. And the area, other than during the Vietnam War, there really wasn't a whole lot going on down in the area. So of course China would see an opportunity with that to not only bolster Laos's economy, but also with the ulterior motives of China boosting their own economy and just exerting their sphere of influence.
I think when you were talking about the water, I think when I read from what I took from it was that the abundance of water can be used as maybe for energy, because they say that they trade energy between the nations wherever they go. So I took from it that they would probably use the water from Laos to
maybe build some hydroelectric power dams.
Exactly.
Didn't say it in the book, so that's why I saw it and I was trying to think.
Yeah.
Well, also, he talks about the building of the rail system, even though we maybe think of it as bringing back natural resources to China. But he spends time saying that it's also tied into Chinese real estate development. So developers are following the rail track to set up cities for Chinese who want to move out of China to live in Southeast Asia. And so, again, because it's a short book, he doesn't go into enormous detail about it, but then you get this idea that there's a lot of Chinese that would like to pack up and leave China and move south.
Yeah, one particular country that definitely has an issue with this would be the country of Malaysia. The author goes and talks about, again, that Chinese investors and government officials are buying land around the railroad right-of-ways to build these cities and resorts and everything. And the government of Malaysia, sensing that this is a big issue, they're really trying to resist China from rapidly expanding and building these projects. So really, I had a thought.
I agree with you. And also, China and Malaysia have actually built a good relationship because Malaysia makes investments in China, and China is building a city in Malaysia. So they both have worked hand in hand to accomplish something together. So the author also mentioned that there are some parts of China that Malaysians live in, so they kind of have a good relationship. And
I think he said that they trade about 80 billion annually or
Yes.
so. I mean, that means they have good relations of some sort, because they would not be trading that much money if they didn't have any type of relation with each other.
Yeah.
I was wondering when he brought up the city of Baton in Laos as something that sort of bloomed overnight. It talks about the Laos government removing people from the area so that therefore you can more easily develop it, and then suddenly it takes off, becomes this special economic zone, and therefore develops casinos and has all the Las Vegas lifestyle to it, and then suddenly it disappears. That you're looking at so many of these countries sort of being hungry for the Chinese economic development money because they don't have their own. So they become very dependent on China's sources of dollars or money.
Absolutely. Along with Baton, and there are also other cities, especially even within China's own territory, that have really just fallen by the wayside. He coined them as ghost towns, and they were basically huge urban areas that they were supposed to be constructed and then sold very quickly to investors to try to get the economy going in a local area. Particularly this particular ghost town, I wish I could remember its name, but it was in an autonomous region in Mongolia that China decided to try to develop the infrastructure. Well, the buyers never really showed up to purchase the city, so it still sits there to this day, completely vacant.
Yeah, they're so quick to build sometimes that they don't really assess what it's going to cost for the investors to buy the land, how many people are going to come, if people are going to come. So there's a real sign, a few of them, exactly those ghost towns that you're saying. They just build and build and build, and then they start now trying to think of where we're going to get the people to come here. And people might not want to come there, people might want to, but then when people don't want to, it's a result of that. They waste hundreds of millions of money just so that they can build a city and no one goes to live in it.
Yes, it's very interesting that China is actually trying to link these continents together, trying to make them closer together by building railroads, seaports, and everything all around. Even though in Africa, Asia, Southeast Asia, and everywhere, even though some poor countries in Africa may not be able to afford all of these things, they're willing to do it in order to make sure that transportation is easier across the world. So I find that very, very interesting that China is actually doing this to better the world.
One way China is really going at this, and this is particularly true in Africa, they are in an effort to try to expand infrastructure within countries in Africa. They are issuing these countries these loans that really don't have a time limit or have a really small interest rate to try for them to invest money in developing railroads and hydroelectric power stations and what have you. Well, since these countries are for the most part really poor and have a lot of difficulty to pay back, China will then go ahead and in their contracts basically say, well, we have some sanctions here, and now it's really more or less our railroads and our power plants that we can control. If I could mention a good backup video that for our viewers can find on YouTube, there is a channel called Wendover Productions, and he does a lot of economic statistics behind major construction projects around the world. And this particular video is called How Africa is Becoming China's China. I would highly recommend that video for those of our viewers that want to study this a bit more in detail.
The term he uses is railroad diplomacy. And so then that's why he says that China gets a lot of money to these countries. They see the economic development, they don't have their own money to develop it, and then it moots whatever criticism they might have of China. So he's pointing to countries that suddenly, like Malaysia, may be critical of certain things that China's doing, but not being too critical. And so then they're still hoping that this railway line, and it isn't just through Southeast Asia. He talks about it going to Iran, he talks about it going to Pakistan, he goes into a lot of depth on China and Africa, so that you're looking at these railway lines. I assume at some point the idea is to see how they all interconnect, and not just a situation through Southeast Asia.
Yes, sort of going back to what you were saying, you can, if you look at all these places that China has gone invested in, you can see a simple trend. They give these countries money, and these countries are somewhat unable to pay back. You know, like the loan is going to be so big that it's going to add a lot to their national debt. And then simply China is going to tell them, okay, instead of paying us this whole amount, just give us this piece of whatever we built, and we'll control it. So it's basically like they're just building their own things for them in other countries legally, without having to go and say, we're going to take this from you, you know? They're doing it by giving them loans, like how they said when they built the railway line for Kenya, it put their debt over half of their GDP. You know, something like that would be something that a country, if they're given an option to pay less than what they should, they will take. Same thing as Sri Lanka with the seaport. It's a very strategic place to have, and they were unable to pay because if they try paying it, the country will be absolutely bankrupt.
Yes, I agree with you, but I would also say that it's a win-win situation, because China is actually helping these countries because they're not ahead of other countries with infrastructure and technology-wise. So if they want to do something or build an infrastructure in Tanzania, for example, they're actually helping that country. But they definitely would want to gain something out of it. The author also mentioned that it's called a win-win strategy. So I would expect that they want to gain something out of doing such a favor to Tanzania. So,
in a way, China is really just reflecting how the United States was basically acting at the beginning of the Cold War with their Marshall Plan, where they were going to help boost the economy of Western Europe and also just give them military protection from the Soviet Union, just to really get the ball going in Europe. And we see this today really with China developing all this infrastructure in other countries in Asia, in Africa, and it really helps their foreign policy image that China is really wanting to portray. They're wanting to portray themselves as basically being a force for good, despite the fact that there are a bunch of domestic issues at home. It's an authoritarian regime. So they're really doing this also just to help keep the United States off their backs.
Well, they talk, though, about parts of the United States, because he says China was selling rail systems, particularly in Springfield, Massachusetts. So they talk about the revitalization of a manufacturing base in Springfield, Massachusetts, based on Chinese rail systems. So he only briefly brings it up, but trying to show how they're more than just Southeast Asia or Africa, but they're more of a global reach. And so he goes on to talk about how Massachusetts just seems to be very enthusiastic about the Chinese rail development and investments.
Yeah, they've definitely helped a lot of U.S. subway systems. I think they said Massachusetts, Chicago, Los Angeles, and all of those were using old subway systems, and they brought for them cheaper, faster, and more up-to-date with technology subways. So yeah, it definitely shows that China is not only reaching to Europe, Asia, and Africa. They're actually trying to reach out to everywhere, because they feel like if they have the knowledge of all this good technology and they can bring it at an affordable price, then everyone should be able to have it.
I got a kick out of the section in the book about building something called Forest City in Malaysia. And so their expectation is once the rail system is set up, Apparently, I guess real estate agents from China are already selling where the expatriate Chinese can live in this city that's going to be built from scratch. And they're projecting that, I guess at some point, again, it seems like it isn't going to be that far in the future, there'll be 700,000 people living there. So if you're saying 700,000, you're really going to end up probably with a lot more than that. But it sounds like all those people are from China, that they're not Malaysians that are going to live there. And that's the idea of this city, is to allow the Chinese to leave China and go live in Malaysia.
And the really interesting thing about Forest City in Malaysia is that China really doesn't want to stop with just one. Rather, the author, he talks about how it's more or less a template for other cities that China wants to build as their railroads expand both south and to the west as well. So sure, they're starting this Forest City from scratch, but it's really just a template to basically usher in an era for them of building these basically mass-producing cities to spread.
Yes, it's pretty much expected that China will want to own something of Malaysia because, like you said, Malaysia and China have a good relationship since 2009, so I'm not very surprised with that Forest City and Chinese people living there.
We only have a few moments left, so what did you think of this book, and do you recommend it to people watching the show?
I like the book. It really gives an insight as to what's going on in the Far East. A lot of political books that we read on this show, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers do as well, are really more or less about American politics and what's going on in the American economy. So it's really good to have a book like this to just show us what else is going on in the world, and particularly in China, which is the up-and-coming superpower of the world.
Yes.
Yeah, I really found it a very interesting book showing us just how much China is impacting the world and how far their reach is right now and how far they're going to get going. And it's an interesting thing to see.
Yes, I think the book is very, very loaded with information about how China is spreading their wings across countries and helping Asia, Africa, Western Europe, and everywhere in the world. And I would definitely recommend it to students to read.
Yeah, towards the end of the book, they're saying what are the qualities that China had to help its railway system grow, and he came up with 3 words: dysfunction, corruption, and poverty, which I thought was, even though you're looking at this sort of having a positive impact on how you're looking at it, helping these other countries, the way they managed to get in there is sort of maybe a bit shady. And again, such as when you're looking at Baton City, that it doesn't always bring the highest quality of life. So it's an interesting short book, but it provides sort of something to think about and see what China's doing. So thank you for joining us today.